Hi, my name is Jenny Lauren Dowden for Conduit News, and today we have Dr. Matthew Lee with us. He's Director of Research at the Association of Christian Schools International, and he's also an adjunct professor of education policy at Johns Hopkins University. Hi, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jenny.
Well, you and several colleagues recently released a study that is really fascinating concerning private schools. But before you get into that, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your education reform work.
Yeah, great. So I was a public school teacher. I actually taught at a charter school system up in Massachusetts for some time before I went to grad school. And that was really my first exposure to school choice as a policy mechanism. I really saw how it empowered families as they chose which school was best for their kids. And it also introduced competition into the school system and forced a lot of the other schools in the area to improve their offerings as they had to compete for their students. And so I became interested in studying how school choice can be used to improve the education system as a whole. And that's what brought me over here to the University of Arkansas for graduate school, where the Department of Education Reform has really assembled this phenomenal faculty with a lot of faculty members who have contributed a lot of really significant research to school choice. Folks like Patrick Wolf, who's been on the show before, Jay Green, Robert Castro, Robert Moranto, and folks like that. So it was really great to study with them. And over the course of my graduate years, I think the program was really top-notch in terms of imparting the technical skills for doing this kind of research, but it also emphasized the importance of thinking profoundly and philosophically about education. And so a lot of our coursework, we had to think about what the purpose of education was. And I think it's important to think about the purpose of education before you can think about the way in which schools should run or the way in which education policy should govern those things. And so it was really over the course of my graduate studies that I came to the realization that my work with education, my research on education policy, the way in which I study schools cannot be separated from my Christian faith. And so I had the wonderful opportunity now to serve as you mentioned, the Director of Research for the Association of Christian Schools International. It's an organization that is committed to advancing kingdom education across the world. And I think uniquely positioned to do so. Our services reach nearly 30,000 schools across the world, about 5.5 million students across the world. And so to do research for an organization like that is just a really tremendous blessing for me.
Yeah, I bet. Well, talk to us then. So you mentioned that your faith, you could not separate your faith along with the work that you were doing on education. So talk to us more about that. Why is that so important? Talk to us about faith-based education in particular.
Yeah, so as a Christian, I think the Bible forms the foundation and the guide for everything that I believe about who I am and how I conduct my life. And I think education is no different. There are a lot of passages that we can turn to for understanding a biblical foundation for education. I'll just mention three of my favorites. The first example is from Deuteronomy chapter 6, where Moses is explaining God's will to his people. And he starts by saying, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." And so that's God using his covenant name to say, I've already graciously entered into a relationship with my people, and therefore I expect you to live according to these ways. I don't expect you to merit a relationship. I've already graciously granted that. And what Moses then goes on to do is to tell the people of Israel, well, this is how you are to tell your children about who God is and what he's done for his people. And what I love about Deuteronomy chapter 6 is that the exercises that parents are to engage in with their children are essentially simple. It's when you rise up, when you lie down, as you go, as you stand, as you sit down. These are all opportunities for you to teach your children about who God is. It's not a complex curriculum. It's not the most, the latest, the most recent teaching methods or anything like that. It's just as you walk through your doorposts, put God's commandments and his precepts on your doorposts, in front of your eyes, and just teach your children all day long about who God is. And so I think that's a great passage to turn to. I also love Joshua chapter 24, when he's giving his final message to the people of Israel. And he says, choose this day whom you will serve. And as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And again, there's an example of a national leader who didn't think that it was beneath him, even though he was leading the country at that point, to lead his own family in instructing his children how to follow God. And the wonderful blessing of that passage in Joshua is later on we read that his leadership really extended to the entire nation of Israel, and they were faithful to follow God, not just in Joshua's lifetime, but actually in the lifetime of the elders who outlived him. So the blessings continue for his people there. And then perhaps my favorite psalm, Psalm 127, is a psalm about God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. It starts by saying that unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. And then a verse that a lot of people like to quote, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. And I think the psalmist turns to that as the chief example of God's sovereignty and man's responsibility coming together. So families have a responsibility to raise their children, but they can only do so by trusting in the sovereignty of God.
So talk to us then about how a religious education for their kids translates over to parental school choice and education. You know, recently, or an article that you wrote, and you said that there's a strong biblical foundation for a parental prerogative in education. And it just so happens that research backs that.
Yeah.
So what does that look like, and how does that play out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really appreciate you asking that. And I would say that the biblical foundation for education makes it clear that the authority to direct children's education lies with parents, first and foremost. And so from a policy point of view, I'm always in favor of a policy that empowers families to make that decision for their children. There have been 4 recently published research articles this past year and in 2021 that looked at different education systems and found that even though they're comparing students who perform similarly and comparing schools of similar quality, when parents have the freedom to choose the school for their children, it has benefits for the children, both in the short term and in the long term, and both in terms of academic outcomes, but also in terms of labor market and health outcomes. So the empirical research backs up what I believe to be true from the Bible, that parents are given the authority to direct their kids' education, and there are blessings for the kids when parents do so.
And we're really seeing over the past several years, parents really asserting themselves and calling for that, wouldn't you say?
That's right, yeah. And just last year, 19 states have expanded or enacted new private school choice programs. And this year we had a big one with a win in Arizona passing a universal education savings account. So this movement is gaining a lot of steam, and I hope it comes to Arkansas.
I know, we do too. Well, listen, okay, let's get to the study that was published by you and your colleagues. It talks about the effect of private school regulations on school participation. It was really interesting to read. Tell our viewers about that.
Yeah, so what we did was, it was a randomly assigned survey experiment, and randomly assigned experiments are considered the gold standard of social science research. So the difficult thing with studying humans is how do you find a human that's a perfect counterfactual of another? You pretty much can't, but a random assignment study is the closest thing to doing that, because the treatment group that an individual person was assigned to is totally independent of any of their characteristics or qualities that they bring to the table. And so what we did is we took our entire ACSI US membership and we divided the school leaders into a control group or one of 4 treatment groups. And the question basically asked them, how likely is it that you would participate in a private school choice program under a set condition? The control group said this participation would have no changes to your school operations or additional government regulations. And so each of the treatment groups really could test that individual regulation, how it would dissuade a school leader from participating. And again, because it was randomly assigned, we would expect that school leaders in all 5 of the groups would have responded similarly were it not for the regulations. And so we can really attribute this as the effect that each regulation had. So the 4 treatment groups, the first regulation was standardized testing. Your school would have to administer a standardized test to all of your students each year. And then you had open enrollment. You couldn't require your families to indicate agreement with a statement of faith, and that you had to accept all students by random lottery if your school was oversubscribed. There was one regulation that was an employment regulation. You couldn't require faculty or staff to agree with the statement of faith. And then the last one is what we called copay prohibition, which is a common feature in a lot of private school choice programs. Typically, the value of a voucher or an education savings account is set at one level. For our study, we set it at $7,500. And a copay prohibition says if your school's tuition is ordinarily higher than that, you couldn't charge families the difference to make up the difference between the voucher amount or the scholarship amount and your tuition. And so those were the four treatments that we looked at.
Okay, and then how did they play out?
Yeah, so we expected that each of them would kind of be, have a negative effect because private school leaders value their autonomy and they tend to avoid regulations as much as possible. Surprisingly, the standardized testing requirement and the copay prohibition had no effect whatever. We couldn't find any statistically significant differences between the school leaders who were assigned to those groups and the control group. However, the open enrollment mandate and the employment regulation, both of them virtually killed all participation. And so we found at baseline, the control group, about 80% of school leaders were willing to participate in a private school choice program. And that's great news for private school choice programs as they're legislated. But the open enrollment mandate reduced participation by about 65 percentage points. And the employment regulation reduced virtually all participation by about 80 percentage points.
Well, talk to us about that. Explain to our viewers why that would be.
Yeah, so I think any organization wants to protect its right to hire employees who are aligned with their vision and their mission and their organizational goals. And schools are no different. It's the legal right is called the right to hire on mission. And so private schools and religious private schools in particular have always highly valued this right to hire on mission. That is to hire faculty and staff that agree with what they're trying to do, which is to impart to present education that is presented from a particular biblical worldview. And so agreeing with a school statement of faith is fundamental to doing that. And so, of course, it was no surprise to us that we found that no school leader was willing to put up with that regulation in particular.
Was there anything that you all were surprised about whenever you had the results from the survey?
Well, so previous studies have kind of found similar results. And so in that sense, there wasn't anything too surprising. You had Corey DeAngels on the show recently and also Patrick Wolf, and the two of them, along with Lindsay Burke of the Heritage Foundation, did the same study in Florida and California and New York using the general population of private schools. And they found pretty much the same thing. And so we weren't surprised from that perspective. We were, I think, a little surprised by the standardized testing requirement not reducing participation rates. But we actually found that for schools in the Northwest region, it also eliminated participation rates. And so we dug a little bit more deeply into that to figure out why that was going on. It turns out that Washington State actually protects private schools' right not to administer standardized tests, not to be subject to a testing regime. And I think private schools in Washington are aware that that is a protected freedom for them, and therefore they're not willingly giving up that freedom. I think I haven't looked at all the other states and looked at how their laws are written specifically with respect to standardized testing. But I think if more states were willing to protect that freedom for schools, the freedom from testing regimes is also the freedom to teach your curriculum as you will. Then I think we would have found more schools not willing to participate under the testing regime.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. Well, the landscape, the educational landscape is rapidly changing, especially coming out of COVID. So how does this study relate to school choice legislation and the current systems that we have in place, or the types of different schools that we've seen, especially pop up since COVID?
Yeah. So you mentioned, we already mentioned last year, 2021, dubbed the year of school choice because 19 programs were enacted or expanded. We had the big one in Arizona earlier this year. School choice is coming to a lot of states, and parents are demanding this. And especially, I think, the coronavirus pandemic exposed for a lot of parents what the public schools were doing, and also showed them that they were capable of governing and directing, superintending over their kids' education. And so interest in private schooling has shot through the roof. Before COVID, 50 million US students in K-12 schools across the country, 5 million of them enrolled in private schools, excuse me. After the coronavirus pandemic, or I guess now, as we're coming out of the pandemic,
Thank goodness.
that number has risen to 6 million. And so that's a 20% increase in private school enrollment. And we also have seen new models pop up, things like micro schools and hybrid schools, pandemic pods, different variations of homeschooling and home education. So a lot of families are realizing that they are empowered to direct their kids' education. And that's coming in the form of education savings accounts like in Arizona and in private school choice programs in other states as well. I think, and I hope, and I know you agree with me, I hope it's coming to Arkansas as well. A recent report that was released by the Office for Education Policy at the University of Arkansas said that school choices is widely supported in Arkansas, despite it being a rural state, if you will. And that's across parties. 89% of Democrats, 90% of Republicans support our already existing Arkansas Succeed Scholarship Program, which is a pretty small program designed for students with special needs, military families, and things like that. We also have a pretty small tax credit scholarship program that has widespread support as well. And so politicians are realizing this is a winning issue to campaign on. If you're running for office and you come out as a vocal supporter of school choice, you're going to get the votes. And conversely, if you come out as a critic of school choice, then I think you're going to have a hard time winning these elections.
You really are seeing that, especially on the primaries, school choice candidates winning. Those who oppose it inside with the teachers unions, I mean, their votes are minimal. They're not getting elected.
That's right.
And so parents are definitely speaking. Well, and so I guess that would lead me to my last question. As a policymaker, what you said, how would this study or what implications would this study have towards policymakers? And it would be give parents a choice.
That's right. Yeah. 2/3 of all private schools in the United States are religiously affiliated in some way. And so as policymakers are considering the way to structure private school choice programs, they really need to listen to the school leaders at these schools for how they want these programs to be designed. The previous research on private school programs has found that the more heavily regulated a program is, the less willing private school leaders are willing to participate because they're giving up their freedoms. They're giving up flexibility and autonomy, the right to govern and direct education in the way that they best see fit. And it's also the private school choice programs that are the most heavily regulated, that have had the least favorable outcomes for students. And so I would say give as much flexibility as possible to these schools, as few regulations as possible to govern these private school choice programs. And I think parents will find the schools that are really fitting for them. I think, Patrick recently mentioned on a recent segment here that the Supreme Court has consistently defended the constitutionality of religious schools participating in private school choice programs. And I really just have one comment to add to that. He mentioned the Trinity Lutheran versus Comer case up in Missouri that was decided a couple of years ago. It was a 7-2 decision. So you even had the progressive justices aligning with the conservative justices on that, because it's really not a contentious issue. Stephen Breyer, one of the justices that typically sides with the progressives, but actually voted with the conservative majority on this case, wrote a great concurring opinion for that decision, in which he said, well, when we have a church building or another building, a religious building that's on fire, we wouldn't stop the fire department from sending their publicly funded resources to put out that fire there. And so in the same way, this early education program at Trinity Lutheran was entitled to this public program that was making these old recycled tires available for playgrounds. That's something that would make their playgrounds a lot safer. And so in the same way, if a program is publicly available, it's actually discrimination to prevent religious private schools from participating.
And that's not going to stop the critics.
It's not going to stop the critics.
I know. It's like, okay, facts over feelings.
The West Virginia case is currently, the program there is currently being tried by the courts, and I'm confident that it will be ruled in their favor, in favor of the schools that are participating. But people try, despite the fact that there's a pretty consistent court judicial record siding in favor of religious liberty on this issue.
Well, anything else that you want to mention that we didn't cover about the survey, and then just school choice?
I thought you asked some really terrific questions. I guess one other thing I would mention about our research project was that we found that schools that offer more special programs, accredited programs, these are characteristics of schools that I think parents would probably find desirable. They're probably looking for schools that offer perhaps an online program, an alternative curriculum, extracurriculars, a gifted talented program, things like that. Schools that had those kinds of programs, accredited schools, were less willing to put up with regulations.
Okay.
And so there might be an even greater hidden cost associated with regulating private school choice programs. If you're chasing out the schools that parents really want to send their kids to, and only letting in the schools that that parents probably aren't desiring because they don't offer the programs that they're seeking, then that's probably going to lead to an even greater cost by regulating these private school choice programs in that way.
Okay,
So another
so
reason not to regulate them by adding in
regulations.
standardized testing or open enrollment, any of these things, they're really going to dissuade private schools who are doing great work from participating in these programs.
Yeah, let them thrive, give them choice and fewer regulations.
That's right.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you
Hope
for
you
having
come
me.
back on again soon.
I hope so.